Thank you very much, and thank you to my friends at the Asahi Glass Foundation for this incredible honor, and thank you all for coming this afternoon and giving up your time on a beautiful Saturday in Kyoto. So these two related issues of climate meltdown and biodiversity collapse are existential problems. We have to fix them. They are the defining issue of our times. And I've been working on them in different ways for around 40 years. And my brief for this lecture is to try and take learnings from those 40 years, things that have become clear over the course of the journey, and weave them into a linear narrative that takes us to a place of hope, because I do still feel hope despite the problems, the enormity of the problems. So there have been essentially 5 phases of my vocational life. I started off in Earth history, as you heard, at the Royal School of Mines, and among other things, I drilled scientific drilling off Japan on the ship you see in the picture there, the Glomar Challenger, with Japanese and other Earth scientists. I worked with many eminent Japanese Earth scientists. I also got involved in arms control with university academics keen to show that you could verify arms control treaties. And in the early 1980s, I had a trip to Kyoto to the International Conference Center for a very important conference on nuclear testing as we tried to get a nuclear test ban. Excuse me. My concern about climate change was rooted in the earth science and my research on the geological history of the oceans, and I worked on it full-time from 1989. There you see one book on climate change in the financial sector, many other activities, and of course I attended the climate negotiations and came to the Kyoto Climate Summit in 1997 and saw that happen. Then I moved to solar energy as a solution and set up a solar company, Solar Century, which grew to be, I think, a quite successful company. It was acquired by the Norwegians in 2000. And at that time, I moved on to nature recovery, still on the same problem of climate change and nature recovery, but a different approach. So let me move to the things I think I've learned over those years. First, we have had our successes, those of us who care about these issues. In particular, almost all the world's governments have signed treaties involving nature with ambitious targets. And everyone here will know about these 2 treaties, Paris, building on the Kyoto Protocol of '97, and the Kunming-Montreal framework on Biodiversity 2022. Almost all the world's governments have signed these treaties, but since they've been negotiated, events on the world stage have made it very much more difficult for governments and companies to deliver on the ambitious targets in these treaties. And there are reasons for this that we see in the world all around us. My next 2 learnings have to do with these. First of all, the oil and gas industry has been very innovative in the ways it's kept us locked into dependency, addiction, if you like, to its products. And here's an example from my own life. When before I became concerned about climate change, I explored for oil and gas, and at that time, shale was a source rock from which the oil was created. By 2011, it had become a reservoir rock as well through the process of fracking. And shale was touted on the front page of Time magazine 14 years after the Kyoto Protocol ought to have made it clear to the oil and gas industry that they had to retreat strategically from fossil fuels in order to save the planet. Shale was touted as the rock that could power the world. Big problem. Second problem is that the oil and gas industry and the fossil fuel industries generally have fought hard and dirty to keep us locked into their products. Along the way, they've made good use of some of the biggest PR agencies in the world to spread disinformation, not just misinformation, but disinformation and worse. And I've seen this close to all over the years. It's not controversial. There's so much evidence now. And much of it is confessional. People from this process having crises of conscience and confessing to the problems. So here you see an example from a British tabloid newspaper of burning wind turbines, as though this is one of the problems of our times. But a senior PR executive said to me, for example, that I needed to know, in his opinion, that the oil and gas companies are using black arts to try to kill you. He didn't mean me personally. He meant my side of the debate, the false debate that the PR agencies were charged with whipping up. It hasn't just been the companies, it has been politicians. Too many politicians have defended this ruinous status quo. And there's an example here on the right of a leader of a nation, my own nation, saying that we need to deal with the problem of rising energy prices by getting rid of the solution. So it's not the green technologies that are the problem with soaring energy prices, it's the price of gas and the price of nuclear. But still, he feels able to blame everything on that. And these days we live in so much use of this kind of misinformation and disinformation that people refer to the post-truth world. And this is despite your clear anguish on the streets, children in particular, the international protests over climate change. And it's so difficult to understand when you look at the stakes, because if people who persist in the view or deny the view that there's a problem with climate change have got it wrong, then we're building infrastructure on coastal plains, sometimes on beaches, as though sea level rise doesn't exist. And these are capable of massive pollution. Gas installations, oil refineries, nuclear power plants. And also, we're diverted from what Rob referred to, some of the carbon bomb problems, the feedbacks that can amplify the problem. My biggest concern here is methane hydrates, these ice-like solids that lock up methane under pressure and can release methane when the temperatures go up, particularly in the Arctic. I drilled into one of those when I was an earth scientist, and they literally are a form of bomb. We have one other problem. Before I get on to the better news, we have another problem to deal with, and that is what the neuroscientists have been discovering about how we think as individuals and collectively. Our minds aren't wired to think rationally. It's very difficult to change people's belief systems by arguing rationally. So much of it is about emotion. And there's an enormous amount of evidence for this. One of the books that summarizes it, Dan Ariely's book, Predictably Irrational, talks about how standard economics assumes that we're rational, but we're far from that in our decision making. We are, in fact, predictably irrational. So this adds to the difficulties of responding. It's not universal. Rational arguments can prevail. A recent example, I think, could pose major problems for those who defend the status quo. In July 2025, as many or perhaps all of you are aware, the International Court of Justice, the 15 judges, ruled that governments and companies must make all responsible means, call on all responsible means to stick to the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling target of the Paris Climate Treaty. So what this means is that with investment decisions for fossil fuels going forward, people are going to have to reckon with the risk of litigation. And there will undoubtedly be many more lawsuits now brought against governments and companies that behave as though the Paris commitment doesn't exist. So this is one successful campaign. Another one that managed to communicate a message really well was the carbon tracker case that there's a carbon bubble in the capital markets. And here, the argument is quite simple at one level. If we want to keep global average temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, we have a remaining budget of 565 gigatons of carbon. But in total proven coal, oil, and gas reserves, there's way, way more than that. And it's all classified as assets on the balance sheets of companies, but it can't be burnt. It's unburnable if we're going to keep to the global warming target. So real risk here, and as I said in the video, even risk of collapsing the capital markets. This has been a potent argument. There's no doubt that this argument has impacted on policymakers and financiers. And here's an example of that. The gentleman on the left is Mark Carney, current Prime Minister of Canada, but he was Bank of England governor at the time this photo was taken at the Paris Treaty. In 2013, the Bank of England, as I saw in meetings, rejected this argument completely, said it's wrong. By 2015, Governor Carney was an enthusiastic advocate of it, and there's no doubt that this helped in the negotiation of the Paris Climate Treaty. And he points out whenever he gets the opportunity that this isn't actually a problem, it's an opportunity. If we deal with deconstructing this bubble by accelerating clean energy and other greenhouse light technologies, we will be taking advantage of an opportunity economically. So one of the industries that we need still to influence is the insurance industry, and it's bewildering that they've failed for so long now to address the risk of climate change at source for decades. I ran a campaign to try and highlight this problem in the early 1980s. In 1983, I presented a white paper to Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, and I argued then that in high places in the industry, there are real fears for the very future of stable insurance. Markets should do something about this. And the industry can look to active strategic protection of the market in which it operates, particularly, of course, by strategically withdrawing investments from fossil fuels. Some insurers at the top of the industry were listening to this at that time, not enough to make a difference, but Time magazine reported in 1994 that the president of the Reinsurance Association of America had invited this case to be heard by all the leaders of the insurance industry. 1994. And then fast forward through all those red bars showing the actual evidence of increasing global average temperature. And now in 2025, the leading insurance player, Howden, the broker, reports that insurability is now a gating issue for capital. If an asset or operation is uninsurable, it's likely to be uninvestable. Insurance is no longer just about protection, it's a barometer of climate readiness and long-term asset value. So we must keep going with these arguments because they are so powerful, notwithstanding the difficulty of impacting belief systems because of the way people think. And we have so many ways of doing this. Rob talked about a good few in his talk, and I've had personal experience of one, which is the solar revolution. Solar energy, as you see in the orange curve there, grew exponentially from around 2006. I had set up a solar energy company to try and help make this happen, and that company also grew exponentially, kind of at the same level, and it was driven by the cost down of solar panels that you see in the blue line, which Japan had so much to do with in the early days of that descent. And here you see on the right some of the installations of the company I set up on roofs of houses, essentially zero carbon houses, given energy efficiency in parallel, and on top of a vast retail store. This is the kind of thing that has now become really common around the world, and still there's so much potential for more solar as we go. We have to repeat this. We know we can do it, and we have to repeat it in the market that's relevant to nature recovery, biodiversity collapse. Investors have to do what they did 2 decades ago and begin putting money into that market. And here you see an example of the kind of thing that needs to be supported. The picture on the left there is small remnants of temperate rainforest on the west coast of Scotland. My company, Highlands Rewilding, is in the process of expanding them to a much, much larger area. So this is a microcosm, an exemplar of what can be done. And if we do that, we take carbon down out of the atmosphere, and we increase biodiversity at the same time. And on the right, you can see the financial services industry trying to find its way to, as they call it, de-risking these problems. And they have set up task forces, as you saw, a task force on climate-related financial disclosure. There's now one on nature as well. So that process is beginning to happen, but it needs to happen. It needs to happen faster. And for it to happen, governments have to stick to the promises they made in these treaties and deliver on policies that can actually make these things happen. They didn't sign these treaties in any sort of cynical way. They signed them because so many of their scientists were advising them about the problem. But actually bringing the policies in is difficult. And one of the reasons that it's difficult is that there is a grave threat to democracy in the world today, and governments are under a lot of pressure. Democracy is vital if we're going to defeat these problems. It's rising. It's falling in multiple countries, and one of the reasons for that is rising inequality. There's a lot of anger in the world, a lot of people who don't believe that traditional politics can solve their problems and are open to the arguments of the far right in multiple countries. And this inequality, as you see here in the plot between an index of health and social problems and income inequality, is really dire in a number of countries. 21 developed countries there. Japan actually plots best. The United States plots worse. UK is roughly in the middle. And even the World Economic Forum knows we have a problem here. As they put it in their Strategic Intelligence Report of June 2021, unchecked capitalism, dizzying technological change, grossly disproportionate pay, and intensive financial globalization. All this is adding to the problem of the erosion of democracy. And again, none of this is controversial. Here you see the plot of the Democracy Index score plotted by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And the stats show that democracy, year by year, is declining. That's what we have to reverse. So what does it mean for communication? And here I come on to new thinking that many people are doing about how we communicate these problems. Do we communicate in the language of environmental disaster and crisis? Can this work? And many of us are beginning to think, no, we need to communicate in a different way. And Systemic, the sustainability think tank, has produced a really useful report on this in June 2025. And they conclude that we need a major reset in our narrative, strategy, and stakeholder capital building. And this should include a new frame for the sustainability agenda based on the promise of a better life and an abundant, thriving, and safe home for all. So they're basically saying we need to talk about the things that Rob emphasized in his talk about what can happen for clean air and health if we reverse out of, for example, burning gas in our homes. And there are so many examples that we can use that actually can be framed in terms of prosperity, growing prosperity by doing the things that, oh, by the way, solve the climate issue as well, if you believe that that is a problem. So I come now to exemplars. I think that there's a fantastic role for exemplars in helping persuade people simply by showing them what can be done. And I'm going to talk about one exemplar. There are so many of these solutions, exemplars in the world that we could turn to. But I'm going to talk about one, my favorite, in the rest of the lecture. Before I do that, I'd ask you to imagine that 2,000 years ago, you were an engineer and you had to persuade the right people that something like this aqueduct could actually be built, would be investable, and would solve a dire problem, the supply of water, sort of relevant to a problem that we have today. Somebody did that, and then they built a large number of these incredible things that provided a whole empire with water. So it's within the human compass to do this, I think. And my favored exemplar is the forestry construction pump. And here you see a diagram of how it operates. It's a relatively simple idea. We grow and restore more forests, way more forests than we have on the planet today. That sucks carbon dioxide down out of the atmosphere in much larger quantities, and then we turn it into timber. We keep it out of the atmosphere completely by building much more with timber than we do at the moment. Japan is better than many countries at doing this as things stand, but we need it to happen internationally in multiple countries, and then we create a genuine carbon capture and storage pump that is also pumping prosperity. And this is how I think it could be sold, not as a carbon pump, not structured as an argument about climate change, but structured as an argument about prosperity. Because if we do this, the carbon storage piece, then we create a number of things that grow prosperity. Jobs, salaries, reviving rural economies in a world where many rural economies are suffering badly. Affordable homes in a time of national housing emergencies, many of them that can be dealt with timber, affordable homes. Flat-packed, off-site constructed and manufactured to so-called passive house standard, very energy efficient. Think homes that require almost no energy bills at all and little or no burning of fossil fuels. And then community income from monetized natural capital. So as we grow these forests, we grow them in a way that increases biodiversity, not decreases it. And there are plenty of ways that can be done. And so you get a solutions exemplar that's dealing with both climate and biodiversity. Then, by default, we also do another interesting thing. We deprive aggressors who rely on fossil fuel income of money with which to buy and finance their weapons systems. And this is a very important byproduct of this notion. A bit more on prosperity. Many nations have housing crises, and traditional construction can't be the answer. It is, in fact, the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. 40% of all global emissions derive directly and indirectly from the way we build houses and buildings today with concrete, steel, bricks, and we need to move much more to timber to do that. Off-site manufactured timber panels of the kind that you see being lowered into a roof there of an affordable building going up in Scotland, and you see two headlines from Scotland, which is a nation where I live, of course. It's a nation that's perfectly positioned for this idea of a solutions exemplar of a nature prosperity pump. And I talk about that in a bit more detail if you're interested in an annex to the paper. I don't talk about it here, but if you want to read more details, then of course you can do that there or contact me for more information. So finally then, this idea of a nature prosperity pump, how could we go about it? There are all sorts of ways, and I don't think I'm going to go into the detail of this slide, but it's just one idea of how it could be brought about. It would involve 4 major investor types who would look at the problem and the solution and think, you know what, this is something we have to do. If we want a livable future, we have to do this. A future to do business in, a future, if you're a company like an insurer or a major retailer reliant on timber, or a multinational conglomerate with all sorts of interests, you want to do that because you're not going to have a world to do business in down the track unless this is done. So this solution exemplar, I think, could be kicked off with a fund of about $1 billion, not that much in the wider scope of things. We in the world today spend $2.7 trillion a year at the moment on weapons systems. And this is our enemy, climate change and biodiversity collapse. So we need at least a significant fraction of that peace dividend to bankroll things like this. Or a state pension fund. You know, you're going to provide pensions for people, but they need a livable world into which to retire. So it should be so obvious that something like this could be done. And I do believe $1 billion fund could do this particular solutions exemplar really quite quickly, kick it off. So to my conclusion. As you will all know, the Asahi Glass Foundation compiles an environmental doomsday clock every year. And as with previous years, the 2025 version shows that it's dangerously poised. This is a poll of experts. Many experts know we're in deep trouble, and that's reflected in this poll. But for me, hope does still live. It lives in solution exemplars, multiple solution exemplars. I've only talked about one, and I've encountered a good few in my life and can dream of the one I talk about and others based on these encounters. So I invite you to share my qualified hope for the future and help make it happen. Thank you very much for listening to me.